Before we get started, I wanted to let you know about EE Power Day 2024 on May 2nd. It's a one-day free virtual conference and trade show designed for power engineers. It features 3 keynotes hosted by me and 5 live sessions from industry experts, including live Q&A, and also there are some giveaways. If you like this podcast, you will definitely like EE Power Day 2024 on May 2nd, so do a quick search for EE Power Day or head to eepower.com to sign up. And now, on to the podcast.
This is changing the way people build every single computer in computer science.
From EE Tech and All About Circuits, this is Moore's Lobby. I'm your host, Daniel Bogdanoff. Today in the lobby, I'm joined by Mark Himelstein, Chief Technology Officer at RISC-V International. To date, multiple billions with a B of RISC-V cores have shipped out, and today we're digging into this open standard instruction set architecture that gives chip designers, or really any motivated party, a modular, open, royalty-free ISA. You can use it for free to design a chip. And who better to chat RISC-V than the CTO? Mark, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
When you look at the world of RISC-V, maybe you're like at a restaurant or on an airplane and someone says, hey, what do you do? How do you explain RISC-V to people who are not familiar with it?
Well, it depends on how familiar they are with computers in general. But, if they're not familiar with computers, I just say, that your phone and your laptop each have a chip in them, a computer that runs things. Yeah, they're run by chips from companies like Intel and ARM. We're making a third one that's open and free for everybody to use. And it's a standard like Bluetooth and Wi-Fi and Ethernet and 4K TVs. And, for most people, that's good enough. They kind of get an idea.
Okay. When did you first hear about RISC-V and what were your initial impressions?
Well, surprisingly, I heard about them not long before I had my first interview. I had a buddy I worked with in the 80s, and he called me and said, hey, are you willing to throw your hat into the ring for this? I go, well, what is it? And he explained, and that was like November of 2019, right before COVID.
Can you lay out for me, how does RISC-V and the organization RISC-V play with industry, and what do those connections and separations look like?
Oh, absolutely. And we work very hard to make it very clear. People don't understand that we are a standard. We're the first instruction set architecture of this magnitude that's really a standard. Because in the past, most of the instruction set architectures have been owned by 800-pound gorillas, right? I mean, like big people, because it took a lot of money to do it, right? So people like Sun Microsystems or IBM or MIPS. And over time, a lot of those dumped some of those specs into the open source world, into the open standards world, but they wouldn't survive without those big 800-pound gorillas behind them. It wasn't a grassroots thing. There's some magic that came with Linux. What Linux did was it said, this is your house, right? It is your operating system. It may not be the best operating system, but it's yours. You can fix it. You can help improve it. And guess what? You're going to get the changes that make it better continuously in the future without paying huge royalty, uplifts and stuff like that. And so it changed the game on how people think about technology altogether. We're not open source. We are an open standard. We don't do any implementations. And we did that on purpose, because things like implementations have restrictions on them, like export control and things like that. We abide by all that stuff because we just don't do them. All we do are specs. The same way Wi-Fi does specs, the same way 4K TVs do specs, we do specs. And so it's very exciting, because in the world of instruction sets, we're the public's house, right? Yeah. It's their house. They helped build this. It got started in Berkeley and brought over in 2015, 2016-ish. But the heavy lifting to make this a usable product by people's, earbuds and laptops and servers and God knows what. That all got done by the communities.
Yeah.
It's their house.
That's a very special thing.
It is. It's amazing. And it was also done in a very modular way so that it could evolve over time. And so, Dave Patterson, who is Krista, who's like the sort of Sadovich, who is sort of the founder of this, his professor at Berkeley said, look, this is a 50-year architecture because it was set up in a way that it could evolve. Things change over time. We can add to it. We can replace things. It's all set up to be done there. That being said, we do have a concept of stability because people are building things. They need it to be supported for some period of time. And so we have the concept of a group of instructions that live together that are supported by all the operating systems and all the tools. And those are called profiles. And we just put out our first profiles in, actually last year in 2023. So we're very excited about that.
It blows my mind to think that someone, especially a professor, who would be confident enough in a technology to say it's a 50-year technology. Because I can't think of much that was like 1974 to today, like maybe utilities, but almost everything else in tech is new.
Right. But also, I think what happened over time was a lot of the things in tech that had to go ahead and grow and evolve over time, they did have versions of things, right? And so it's not like you're using Wi-Fi 1 anymore. It's like Wi-Fi 6, right? And so, but they built that in, that there's versioning and people know which version your device is and which version the router and the access point are. They know all that stuff, right? We're the same way, right? It's that, hey, this version of things works together. There are going to be people who build systems or chips or whatever that they expect to last for 20 years and, not change at all, sitting in telco equipment or something else, right? And then there are people who are going to buy a new laptop every year, right? And they're going to want the latest and greatest and the new servers to run the next great AI ML app. I just got this big circle of AI ML apps. That was just like, I don't know, it's like they fit like 1,000 apps in a little circle.
Yeah.
So it's going crazy, right? Well, a lot of those people are building stuff on top of RISC-V. A lot of RISC-V innovators, IP vendors, chip vendors, board vendors are building accelerators to do AI on RISC-V. And we're adding more extensions. And this is a good example of evolution. What we have special interest groups that worry about strategy and gap analysis and stuff like that. And so we have one in graphics and one in AI ML. And they both came back and said, next thing you got to do is matrix. And so this year we have two groups doing matrix, two different matrices, one that sort of fits in with our current vector implementation, and then another one that's a separately, attached matrix thing with lots of registers and, big implementation and going to 64-bit instructions and stuff like that. So we're very excited about that.
I'd like to dig into the organization of RISC-V as a standards body, which is an interesting way to think about this sort of thing, but it makes sense.
Yeah.
But first, I'm curious, what is the most surprising thing you've seen RISC-V implemented in? And then maybe what's the thing most people have interacted with that has a hidden RISC-V instruction set beneath it?
Well, there's lots of things. So there's a group called Pine 64. It's an org, and they do interesting things for lots of reasons. And and I think somewhere on this table, it's buried somewhere. I can't find it per se. But they made a soldering iron with a RISC-V chip.
I got one right here.
Oh, you do? Okay.
I actually have it. Yeah. I'll
show the crowd. Yeah.
My 3D printed case for it.
Yeah. So that's pretty astonishing. They also... I just saw a little, some really small controller announcement where they ran RISC-V on an emulator, on this little tiny controller, so they can run software on top of it that's already been ported to RISC-V. So, yeah, it's everywhere. I like to say from soldering irons to supercomputers, and it's really true.
And you have an interesting supercomputer history, but we'll save that one for a little bit.
I'm also a poet, but you may not know about that.
Yeah, didn't even know it.
I've written over 1,000 poems. So
wow, that's fantastic. Can you share one? Do you have a favorite or a?
I do. I can share one.
I'd love that.
I do them all in at this point in Apple Notes on my iPhone, so it's pretty easy. So this one's a little sad, but very cool. It's one of my favorite poems I've ever written, and it's called "In the Back," written in March 26, 2016. Out where the frogs croak, a cacophony rebounds between purple and green leaves, gently running water, white noise for the soul. I take some solace here, and only the dogs know why the dragonflies split and the hummingbirds stand still, where my eyes can still see and my heart can still feel one moment of respite and one more glimpse of you.
Thank you for sharing.
Sure.
I don't know how to transition back to RISC-V from that.
There you go.
Maybe that's it. So RISC-V as a standards body, typically there are, often like corporate or academic stakeholders behind it. How did it come to be, and what does the kind of structure of it look like now?
So what happened was, and I'm secondhand telling the story, probably better talking to somebody from Berkeley, but they basically wanted a RISC instruction set so they can do some innovative tests for things like vector and other stuff in around 2010. And so RISC-V was born, and then they started publishing papers and having like seminars, and then there was just a great groundswell going like, we need this, right? And then I think that there's some of the pricing for competitive architectures changed in 2015, 2016. I think that drove a lot of people into the RISC-V camp.
Can you explain, when people said we need this, what about it did people see and say that's what we need?
The real reason is flexibility. People can do whatever they want with it, right? The thing that keeps us as a community is we share the operating system, we share the compilers, we share all the tools, the applications, all that kind of stuff. That's why we're a community. Because even in today's age, even with these monolith companies that have huge, war chests, they can't afford to do all the work it takes to make a new ISA be successful. As a community, we can do it together. And so that's why we stay together. But they still get to tweak it. We don't dictate implementation. So how many stages is the pipe, how many issues, how many cores, how many, per die, what the cache looks like, what the memory interface looks like, all that stuff is theirs, right? And then they can add extra instructions. Like, people didn't want to wait for our vector to be ratified. So they went ahead and did their own. Now they're migrating to ours now that we've released it, but they had a time to market need and they filled it, right? They're allowed to with us. If they want to do that with one of the other, you can't even do it, I think, with some of them. And then if you want to do it with others, you got to pay a ton of money, right? 12-year-olds in India are making their own RISC-V chips.
Interesting. Yeah. How do companies go about, or anyone go about engaging with RISC-V? I understand there's like membership tiers and that sort of thing.
Well, first of all, you don't have to do any of that if you don't want to. RISC-V is free and open. If you don't want to talk to us and you just want to take the spec and implement it, you can do that. We don't stop you from doing that. If you want to start getting involved in defining the specifications and being part of the technical discussion and having colleagues and, doing all that kind of stuff, then you can be a member. You can become an individual member. That's free. And then there's different, categories of membership. Standard companies, typically with a certain size, it's like $35,000 a year. And then you can become a board member all the way for $250,000 a year, right? Those are, I'm sure they change over time, but those are what I know of right now as the prices. And so people decide what involvement they want in governance and making decisions and stuff like that. And there's different levels and they can decide and they can join. But it's the same deal. It's pretty egalitarian. They get the spec, they can implement the spec the same way as somebody who's not a RISC-V member can. So it's an open standard, just like Wi-Fi, just like Bluetooth. Anybody can implement it. And, we have some basic tests today that enable you to test whether you're complying with the standard. We're working on more advanced tests over time. And so there's just lots of opportunities for people to go ahead and engage. We have probably somewhere around 70 technical groups. Half of them are task groups making specifications for some things that are very tiny and some things that are way bigger. Things like vector or how IO and MMU, how the IO talks to the memory management unit. Those are really huge specs. And then they have smaller specs of things like compressed instructions and stuff like that. So people can decide, what they want to participate in. They can decide which group of instructions they want on their particular platform. We have, again, groups of instructions called profiles that people can grab the whole bunch. And those are the things that we tell to the Linux distributions and the compilers that they should follow. And they can hop on the plane, hop on the train any way they want. And we have like a getting started guide. We have a life cycle guide. If you want to go ahead, how do you go ahead and decide, hey, if you want some new instruction, how do you do it? We have instructions on how to do that. It's pretty egalitarian and pretty available for anybody from high school students all the way up to, very seasoned professionals.
You've used the phrase open standard a couple times. Can you describe the difference between open standard and open source?
Yeah, open source actually has a artifact called source code. We don't have source code, right? Okay. And when you have source code, the standard is kind of what you implement in that source code, or they're implementing a standard like Ethernet in the source code. And then there are a whole bunch of standards bodies. Some are run by IETF, some are run by ISO, some are run, by different, alliances. There's the Wi-Fi Alliance, so on and so forth. And those people are responsible really for putting together the specification, right? And, maybe a couple of artifacts to help you with it. But in general, all they do is a specification. They definitely don't do implementations. We don't do implementations. And that's really important in today's very charged political world. By keeping clean that way, it's the implementations that the governments really, look at for things like export control and how performant it is and whether, we're giving away the keys to the kingdom or whatever.
Yeah.
Right. But nobody will say, let's not do the next Wi-Fi standard in open, right?
Yeah.
And we're the same thing. So we work really hard to make sure people understand. And it really is a little unique because remember, Wi-Fi kind of grew up that way.
Right.
Instruction set architectures didn't. They grew up as proprietary implementations. And, we're really, again, one of the first of this magnitude that's an open standard.
What is your role in the RISC-V organization?
Sometimes I like to joke and say I go to meetings and read email. But
me too.
Yeah, you too. It's like I think everybody. But look, I have a lot of experience in leading organizations where people don't report to me and nobody reports to me, right? It's all a volunteer kind of thing. I mean, I have some technical program managers who are fantastic. They're great. They're not implementers, and they aren't judged on how well they do. They're judged on how well the members do, right? And same thing as me. I'm judged on how well the members do. But I sort of crafted the scalable organization that allowed us. When I started, there was about 15 groups, and now there's over 70. There wasn't a whole lot of software effort involved, and so now probably 2/3 of what we do is really software oriented. And we were up working. There are other organizations. There's an organization called RISE, which helps expedite open source software on RISC-V. So we work with other organizations to make those things happen. So my job is to make sure the left hand knows what the right hand's doing, make sure that the processes go through, and we actually produce, since I've come on board, ratified close to 40 specifications, which is unheard of for a standards org in 3.5 years. That's
insane.
It's insane.
That's wild.
And the way you do that is you distribute power down, right? You create a mechanism where everybody can communicate well, and then you push power down and you let people who are incredibly great, smart people do their jobs. And, there's failure at times and we have to step in and help guide those things. I do some of that. I talk to folks like you. I probably have like 3 different, jobs. One job is really strategy and forward-looking planning kind of stuff. One is day-to-day execution and the other is evangelizing. And that's really where I spend my time.
You mentioned that distributing power to the people who are passionate and capable is essential. Can you go into a little more of how you've been able to scale this organization and this technology?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, we a bunch of committees, and the committees are people who actually put a lot of time in and guide everything underneath it. Under there, we have task groups, which create specifications, and we have special interest groups, which drive strategy and gap analysis. The task groups are the ones that are producing work product. In order to do this, each committee has to work with the groups underneath it and create groups underneath it, task groups, to go ahead and create specifications. So the first thing is you have to have a horizontal distribution. So we have unprivileged instructions, or the instructions that go to, in applications. We have privileged instructions. Those are the things that are used in system software, everything from boot codes, hypervisors, operating systems. And then we have a bunch of major groups, but first is privileged software, so operating systems. The second is applications and tools, so compilers and things that are like, for example, libraries that support vector or something like that. We have security, which is one of our biggest groups, and it does everything, memory protection and runtime integrity and, side channel attack, mitigation and blah, blah, blah. So it's huge. It has a lot of groups underneath it. It's working on trusted execution, one of the big things. And then we have what's called SOC infrastructure, which does things like quality of service, reliability, RAS, and it does the IOMU and other pieces that are really between the hardware and software boundary. So the first trick in creating a scalable organization is you get people to run those committees who are passionate and know what they're doing. That's the first thing you do. Because if you don't have people to push power down to, it doesn't work. Right?
Yeah.
And the magic of getting people in who really know what they're doing and have passion about what they're doing. And then I can help them. I mean, I can help them through the processes, because you might imagine there's a lot of checks and balances. We go out for an internal review, we go out for a public review. At each step, there are sign-offs by the other committee chairs. I mean, you can't release Vector unless you're making sure it's got no security goals, right?
Sure.
And so you've got to have the security chair sign off on the Vector spec, right? So all those 40 specs, the process evolved over time, but all those 40 specs, they all got signed off by everybody, including me, from who ran those other committees I talked about. So checks and balances, scalability, passionate people, and then, look, at times you have problems. The question is, okay, so one thing is when things are going well, what do you do? But what happens when something isn't working? How willing are you to face those issues? I don't take things personally. As long as people approach me honestly and openly and tell me what the issue is, I can help them solve it, right? And that's what I try to do. I also, help represent the technical community to the board of directors, and some of the board of director stuff back to the technical community. But then we have, this great amount of infrastructure to support all this. So we've just moved all of our specification status and all the steps and along the way into Jira, because it has a workflow and you can actually move from step to step and step. We have a newsletter out there that, so people don't have to go look at 70 different groups minutes, right? So we have a roll-up of that. And that was a board of directors person's idea. We have a developer dev board seed program where we've given out probably about 150 to 200 boards from everything from distros to college students to hackers to whatever. every year. And we work very heavily with the dev board creators and the distros because there has to be something to run on this. We have a development partners program. The hardware guys weren't as used to this contributor culture stuff that the Linux guys been living for 30 years. So we helped them out a little bit. We got some large organizations to pony up some combination of students and professionals, and they take on work that's needed for a specification to go through ratification. So tests or operating system development or compiler development and stuff like that. So we have a huge array of programs that my staff takes care of in order to support those 70 groups. So we probably have, I would say, many of the leaders run more than one group because they have the sort of the demeanor to do it and stuff like that. So we're very grateful for everybody. It wouldn't happen if we didn't have this community. But I hope I gave you a feeling, a little flavor of what it took to sort of build this thing and what it took to scale this thing.
Yeah, it's no small feat. And something like this, having a kind of a sweet spot community of like 50 to 100 passionate and capable folks will really, in my opinion, drive momentum for something like this. And in my personal circles, I've seen a lot of people very excited about RISC-V in the last few years.
Yes, agreed. And, I think that's a tribute to all those people who did that work because, every specification you get done attracts more people.
Yeah, that makes sense. Can you share a couple signposts, turning point technologies or specs for the RISC-V community over the years? A couple just like, this was a pivotal moment for us.
Yeah, when I came in, they had done a whole bunch of stuff in 2019, but did really only one. It wasn't even an ISA spec. It was a non-ISA spec. It was a debug spec in 2020. And, part of the reason they brought me in was to execute. I ran Solaris for Sun, so I've been through that kind of machinery before. And then in 2021, we were playing catch up. We did 16 specs. It was quite astonishing. In 2022, we did 8. In 2023, we did, 14 or 15, something like that. So we've really started hitting a pace. We also create a fast track mechanism for very small ones to skip some of those steps. You can't stick public review and stuff like that, but we enabled them to go off and do that. But I would say that first crew of 16 that came in the end of 2021, it included things like vector, it included hypervisor, it included bit manipulation. It was just quite astonishing. And so I think that was the point where people understood that we could do this, right? And that we could scale. I mean, look, the competition has been out there for a long time and, we still have things to add. I mean, luckily we have plenty of stuff for people to put out great product, but there's always more. And again, people are flexible. They can go ahead and add little things and then often they bring them back to us and go, hey, we had to do this. Why don't you add it in? And it's pretty exciting. And so that was one thing, I think. I think the second thing was when we realized that it wasn't, hundreds of millions of cores out there, but billions and tens of billions of cores out there. So, there are many people who are in the billion core club, right? There's an earbud manufacturer that announced last August they have already shipped 3 billion cores in anonymous earbuds.
Wow.
Called Bluetron. Qualcomm announced that they had shipped over 1 billion cores. They would tell us exactly how many, but NVIDIA told us that they had shipped over 1 billion cores. So there's just a bunch out there that have shipped over 1 billion cores. I think that was a very big thing. And then I'd say the last thing I would bring up, and I'm trying not to bring everything up, but we, just like everybody else, have problems with supply chains during COVID, right? And so one of the big problems was that was right when people wanted to start coming out with development boards. And it's like, okay, I have this development board, but I've sold all of them out and half the parts that are on there, I can't get for another 6 months, right? That kind of stuff.
Yeah.
That's gone. And at the last summit, we had a table with everybody's development boards. There were like 35 development boards there from different companies. And some of them went up to 128 gig of memory and they're, hawking things and blah, blah, blah. and some of them were really tiny, almost maker kind of things. And so to me, getting past that supply chain issue, because look, nothing happens unless people have boards, right?
Right.
And, now we have boards and, we're giving a bunch away. The vendors are giving a bunch away. People are buying them. It's very exciting. And they're just getting better and better. I mean, if you just take a look at some of the stuff, capable of running honking databases, and then you can all of a sudden go to all the open source database vendors and go, here, would you like a couple boards?
Yeah.
So that's what we do.
A little taste.
A little taste.
You mentioned the part shortage was a thing for you, but can you describe some of the roadblocks you faced and how you've been able to work through those?
Well, sure. I mean, obviously that was a big one. We just discussed it. So I'm, won't say any more about that. But, just getting a bunch of, frankly, VLSI designers to organize into an organization that was scalable, that was difficult. I mean, I spent a lot of time on the phone explaining it, compromising, changing things, whatever, in order to get there. And then trying to get everybody to follow the rules and adoption. We got adoption of the last two steps pretty easily. That's the freeze where you get a public review, and ratification where you go to the board and say, hey, ratify this. But the first one, the plan step, where you actually tell people how you're going to do the other two, that took about a year to do, right? And so that, that was a challenge. I think software people are kind of more used to that on this kind of project. I think there was a lot of education there. We wrote the guides to help people get through some of that stuff. And then, there's just a lot going on. It's confusing to a lot of people. Big companies come in and they don't know how to get on 1,000-mile-an-hour train, right?
Yeah.
And so we work a lot on onboarding. We're working on trying to improve our developer experience. We're a constant improvement. We're a continuous improvement organization. We tell people, look, don't just complain, help us make it better. We don't get everything right. And so being humble and trying to do that, I think is a big thing. And then finally, I mean, the one thing you have to remember, this is cooperation and competition simultaneously. And as you get bigger and bigger players, that appears more and more in the discussions. What you've spent your time already investing in, what you've done in previous products, how to shorten your cycle to releasing product to the public. Those things are all of a sudden factors where, we were working with a couple of startups and, maybe, it's, you talk about NVIDIA, it's special purpose processors, but they're not doing the main thing. They're doing things like security or IO or something like that. But when all of a sudden you start talking about it's the big show, that's a big deal. And so navigating that has been quite interesting. And, sometimes it takes the board of directors to come in and resolve it. Sometimes I run a technical steering committee along with the chair and the vice chair of it, who are members, and sometimes they can help resolve those things. But officially, when you come in the room, you're supposed to do the right thing for RISC-V, right? And help the whole community, right? But it's hard to totally separate that out. And so that's been a bit of a challenge.
That's a classic challenge just in the open source world at large is
agreed.
A meaningful contribution from a company is also a competitive advantage that they could be releasing to everybody or keeping for themselves.
Right. And the thing that's still, I'll repeat it again, the thing that keeps us as a community is the effort in the software ecosystem, right? Nobody wants to really go off and go on their own. They just don't want to do it. It's just too costly. And, I don't care if you're like the biggest company in the world or the tiniest, they don't want to go do their own thing. They want to be part of the pack that's taking advantage of the bulk of the resources that's being, applied, across the set of software.
Yeah. Having a proven track record of success that you're getting yourself onto, I think is helpful in this sort of situation. You mentioned that you've written a lot of onboarding and created a lot of onboarding documentation. Can you describe what would be a sample tool chain that people are using to implement RISC-V?
Well, I think the two that are the most popular are things like GCC and LLVM, right? And both of them have very, very significant RISC-V offerings. But I'd be remiss to say that there are a whole bunch of commercial tool chains that people use, whether it be, all the way from CAD into compilers and stuff like that with, Codasip or compilers like IAR or Green Hills, so there's just a bunch out there. And, we have a fairly established software landscape marketing slide, which has, all those names and icons on there. And it's pretty impressive because, when you start getting into the commercial stuff, people aren't going to do that unless there's a business there, right? And with the billions of cores out there, there's a business there.
So you've mentioned vector a few times. Can you describe to me what that is and how that kind of fits into the overall RISC-V architecture and platform?
Sure. And most architectures have vector units. Most computers, they do simple things, right? They do addition. You take one number, you take a second number, you get a third number when you add them together. Now, if you want, you can, with vector, you can take a whole row of numbers and add it to another whole row of numbers and get a third row of numbers. It's called SIMD. So single instruction, multiple data. And it allows the chip to decide how to move the data in and out of memory. And it can optimize the whole operation. If you had to do it by hand, it would take a long time. And I'll give you an example because there's a great example. So every time we do something around like vector, the security people are waiting right around the corner so they can do crypto vector, right? They want to go do the NIST and Xingmai, algorithms with vector, right? So we started out by just running a 8-row unrolled loop of, doing AES 128. And it took like over 1,000 instructions with the plain old instruction set. Then we went ahead and said, okay, we can just do something that builds some of those algorithms in. And we called that crypto scalar because it wasn't vector, wasn't SIMD. It was working, again, with some individual values, but the algorithms were known by the processor and the instructions. That got it down an order of magnitude down to in the 70s from over 1,000.
Wow.
Now we ratified crypto vector this past year, and that got it down to one instruction. So 2 orders of magnitude, basically, from simple native RISC-V instructions down to the basics. Got it down to one instruction. Now, you still have to go ahead and go through all that data, but now it leaves it up to the processor how to get that data in and out, and it's a lot more efficient. And you don't have to fetch the instructions, and so on and so forth. And so that just gives you an idea about what vector can do. Vectors are rows of numbers, right? What's coming next? Matrices. N by N, right?
Yeah.
It's a matrix of numbers. And that's very, very important for both graphics, AI/ML, DSPs, etc. So we have, great people working on it. The guy who's the chair of our special interest group, which worries about all these SIMD things, is a gentleman from IBM named Jose Morer. And he's just incredible, and he's helped get the stuff off the ground. They're working hard at this, and I fully expect, this is a very big spec, so I fully expect it to go into 2025. But I fully expect 1 or 2 of them will get done in 2025.
Can you describe the impact of having matrix capability versus vector capability, and how that might apply to things like AI?
Again, I think, if you look at the algorithms, there's orders of magnitude improvement, right? So at least an order of magnitude. But remember, we don't do implementations. So it really depends on your implementation of vector or your implementation of matrix that really helps you figure that stuff out. But some people have done just an incredible job in making that stuff go. And also you have the big guys, right? So there's 2 companies that I know of, there may be more, that have over 1,000 cores per die. And they're using as both inference engines and HPC machines. One's Esperanto, Dave Ditzel's company, and the other is Inspire Semi. Dave Ditzel's company has 1,000 cores, the last I heard. Then maybe it's more now. And then Inspire Semi just put 1,500 cores on a die. They talked at the Supercomputer Conference in Denver this past November, and they're putting 4 chips on an accelerator board, which just goes into your PCIe slot. So
Interesting.
very exciting.
Can you describe what else is coming up for RISC-V in 2024 and beyond? Anything you can share publicly that gets you really excited?
Let me talk a little bit about the goals.
Yeah.
And that may give you a good idea, right?
Great.
So we have in the tech part of the world, I'm not talking about marketing and outbound. I'm going to let Tiffany and other folks talk about that. If you look at the tech world, there's three major things we're working on. One is continue to knock off the gaps in the competitive parts. And these mostly at this point are coming from people implementing something and going, well, I had this over here and I need something similar over here. And, how do I do this? And, I'm going to do this in the short term, but we'd like something as part of RISC-V International long term. So there's just a bunch of those. And some of them we've been working on for a while, and some of them really have broad impact and so on and so forth. The second thing is, what do you need to support Android, right? So big news last year, Google supporting Android on RISC-V, blah, blah, blah. And so, they have a set of requests, and we want to make sure that, we have everything in place Android needs in order to be successful. And then the third one is, what does it take for AI and ML to be successful? And so that's where the matrix stuff comes in. And so everything that's needed for AI and ML, those are things that we're going to support. And so it's up to the different special interest groups that worry about strategy and gap analysis and the committees that govern them to go ahead and identify those things and help us start working on them. And there's a technical steering committee that oversees the whole thing, and those needs roll up to them, and they help, balance out where the resources go and so on and so forth. So those are some of the major things, but we have some weird, one-off kind of things that are going on that I think have a broad impact too. So I don't know if you've heard of something called Cherry, CHERI from Cambridge. It really makes implementations, very security safe. Everybody from like Microsoft to, whoever, and everybody's involved in this. And so we have a Cherry special interest group, and they're working on trying to figure out how it fits into RISC-V and so on and so forth. So we have some things like that we are feeding on the side in anticipation that they're going to be important to our members in the future.
Fantastic. Can you share a little bit about your pre-RISC-V history? I was looking at your CV. You've been at some very interesting places doing some very interesting things. Any favorite moments or stories you can share?
Well, just so you and your audience knows, I probably have spent 2/3 of my career at this point consulting.
Okay.
And so I do that for my own company called Heavenstone Incorporated. And I'm, sometimes I'm an architect in a company. Sometimes I'm the VP of engineering. Sometimes I'm just an advisor. Sometimes I'm a mentor. So I do all that kind of stuff. And in fact, before I was at RISC-V, I was doing that for FICO for about 3.5 years. And they were doing anti-money laundering software for a bank that had an order of magnitude more accounts than anything they've seen before. So I helped them figure out how to scale and get stuff done and so on and so forth. So that's the kind of stuff I do. But, if I had to say what the highlights of my career are, number one's got to be MIPS. I mean, we changed how people looked at compilers and the software hardware trade-off quite significantly. I mean, even though Berkeley and those guys really started the whole thing with RISC, Stanford was right in there with MIPS. And I was at MIPS and I think we really upped the game in how you do compilers and how the hardware software traded off. The second one was, very clearly Sun Microsystems, where I ran Solaris for 5 years, and we did things like ZFS, D-trays, zones, stuff like that. And, when I came in there, they said, okay, we want you to do two things. One is like, get these guys to be a little more respectful. And number two, have them innovate, because they had just gone through this transition from Sun OS to Solaris, and this whole deal with AT&T in the early and mid 90s. And they lost some of that innovation piece. And so, we kicked it into high gear and did a bunch of stuff that still today is used broadly in the industry. And then the last one was Graphite Systems, a little ahead of its time. I mean, it was a very capital intensive investment. And I think, the capital intensive investments really happened about 5 years later than when we started it. We ended up selling it off to EMC. But the concept was pretty simple. On a single flash chip, there's actually multiple devices on there. It's not just one flash device. So on a computer system with, in those days, 2015, with 100 terabytes of flash, we had 6,000 devices that the operating system could see. So think of NVMe on steroids, okay? And the idea was if you wrote in a very distributed way, like one file across all those flash devices, then you could read in parallel. And so we had worked on a query from one of the big social media companies that was taking them 200 machines, 30 minutes to do. We did it on one 4-way in 8 minutes. And
wow.
Yeah, it was pretty exciting.
That had to feel good.
Oh, very, very good. And I still talk to the people who are at that company, and they're like, that was one of the best projects we ever worked on. But again, it was ahead of its time. We ended up selling out to EMC, and they got bought.
So you spent a lot of time at a lot of different companies, including consulting. What gets you excited about RISC-V going forwards, and what advice do you have for people who might be in similar situations or are looking to implement new technologies, including RISC-V, but not exclusively RISC-V?
Yeah, I think what was exciting to me when I looked at RISC-V, and what's even more exciting to me now, is the pervasive changes it's making in the industry. So anytime you can be part of something that's like kind of a revolution, that's like changing the way people do things. This is changing the way people build every single computer in computer science, like the whole range. That's amazing. How many people get to say that in their career? And when I'm trying to get students excited about helping us out, I go like, how many times in your lifetime have you gotten to work on a new instruction set? Zero. Yeah. Right? It just didn't exist. Right? All those things were there, and so this is really a groundbreaking opportunity, ground floor opportunity. What gets me excited every day is to get up and help people succeed, help things move forward. That's what gets me excited. And, I would say that my goals and jobs have changed over the years. Like when I first started, it was like, how much I got paid or what technology I was working on. Now it's more of like, who am I working for and with? Do I like them? And like, how long is my commute? My dogs don't like me going anywhere. Right? After COVID, they're so used to me being around.
Yeah.
So I'd say find out for yourself what's important to you. Don't be surprised if it changes in your career. Look at your job, look at your choice of jobs, and try to pick something that meets those goals. Find joy every day, man. It's a short life.
I love that. Yeah, the paycheck can't be the only thing you go after in a job. That's for sure.
Well, there are times when it has to be, and I understand that.
That's fair. We like to do a lightning round near the end of each episode.
Sure.
And one of them is often career advice, and I feel like you just gave that one a little bit. But as a poet, are there any poets or pieces of literature that really get technology right or wrong in your mind?
The Snow Crash guy is pretty amazing.
Stevenson.
Yeah, he's pretty amazing. I'm just, shocked at how prescient he was. The Mona Lisa guy was
Gibson.
Pretty, was pretty amazing. But, it's hard because, things change. I watched Star Trek growing up, and nobody would ever consider a communicator of that size. Right?
Yeah.
A flip phone? Yeah.
They're coming back.
In the 25th century,
They're coming back, yeah. I heard that you worked on the Cray 1, the first supercomputer. What was that like? Can you share any moments?
Well, I did. I worked actually for a place called the Institute for Defense Analysis in Princeton, New Jersey. My professor at that time was one of the solvers of the four-color theorem, and so which was very controversial because it was partially done exhaustively and partially algorithmically, and the stalwarts really didn't like the exhaustive piece,
Purists,
right? Yeah. And but he worked there, and so he brought me down there in the summers, and it really gave me a very big incentive to go to grad school. I'm not sure I would have done it had I not gone there. And they were all masters and PhDs, and so they definitely had nobody came over to me and said you got to go, but it's just like looking at these people who are so smart. And the Cray one was quite interesting. I mean, I did Rank of a Matrix. That was one of my first programs, and it would tell you where it was stopped because it was stalled trying to get stuff from memory or something like that. And it was just a phenomenal experience. And I saw it right next to a CDC 6600, which was basically like a quarter of a football field or something. and here you had the Cray one that fit in my kitchen even today, right?
Yeah.
And cooled with coolant and bucket seats, and I mean it was like amazing.
Yeah.
So yeah, I got to do some fun stuff, and I'm very grateful to them. I think that's the other thing is if you're giving people advice, always find what you're grateful for, what your where your gratitude is. People who are happy are grateful. They're grateful for what they have.
Yeah.
Things may be tough at times, but you got to find gratitude.
Love it. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for talking. It was fun.
That was Mark Himelstein, CTO at RISC-V International. If you're using RISC-V, I'd love to hear about it on the Moore's Lobby social pages. It's always exciting to hear what people are working on. And also, make sure to check out EE Power Day 2024 coming up on May 2nd. We have tons of great keynotes and live sessions happening that day, so go sign up for EE Power Day. Thanks for joining me today in the lobby. I'm Daniel Bogdanoff, and I'll catch you next time.